evening yet again, everyone. Again, if you for some reason watched our EU stream earlier in the day. But for those of you who were at work, due to your North American heritage, or similar, just anywhere in those time zones, we are now having the other Under Night in Birth 2MK Lounge. As you'll note, we've started off with a Nanase this time. And we're expecting to see a lot of that because there's no reason she's likely to leave before the end of stream. I was told earlier that the specifics of our sound on stream are fine, so even though this is a little weird to me, I'm gonna assume everything's okay. At least between Rune Siren and I, this matchup is a lot of fighting aerial battles. And fighting aerial battles at range at that. All this grounded footsies you're seeing, all fake. If anything, our goal is to trap the opponent on the ground, but not necessarily any intention of playing there. If you are anywhere on the rim of the Atlantic Ocean, whether you are in Europe or in North America, or even the Caribbean and similar, feel free to join in this lounge. Especially if you have relatively good internet. Doesn't matter if you're way better than us either. We're always happy to experience all that that is. Though, don't be too disappointed if we can't keep up with your pressure game. This is winner stays on, unlike the EU Lounge. And with one rematch on, but that was the intention for the EU Lounge, so there's that. In this matchup, Seth ends up being a little more straightforward simply because there's no way to easily move around the Nase's defenses once she starts them. You can dodge, but you can't necessarily say, I'm now going to make sure this doesn't hit me, and still deal damage. So my opponent just has to wait for me to move and put something in front as a shield. This is easily solved once she's between moves. But you do have to be careful because of things like that. It is possible for hitboxes to not turn out in your favor at all. If you intend to push forward, it can also be difficult, at least at some times, because she doesn't need to retreat from others as often as many other characters do to prevent damage problems. She can build up her Vorpal faster than Seth normally can. Being forced into the situation where you are defending means that you don't often get to do it. Now, of course, you could just find the right spacing and instead of approaching, charge this up and hope that your opponent doesn't notice it. This is your best option, especially when you're close to winning Vorpal, but have been attacking otherwise. But notice how much of this is me specifically making sure to target the aerial position I'm expecting from my opponent. Honestly, there is some grounded footsies happening here, but I'm never thinking about the grounded footsies aspect of it as something I need to care about. Either my opponent is going to be in defending mode, in which case I could actually try to depth that, or get the throw, or she'll be in the air fairly soon. Similarly, it's much in Nanase's favor to think in the same way. Seth doesn't really have to come down out of the air until Seth feels like doing that, and therefore it makes more sense to target aerial positions, but not necessarily the aerial position that Seth is actually in, just the one you expect. She's fairly well suited to this, but the execution for it can be a little challenging due to the amount of time it takes for some of her moves to happen. She is, however, much stronger against Seth's orbs, stingers, whatever you want to call them, than a lot of other characters because her movements don't tend to lead to her staying still long enough for it to work. Took too long to decide on that one. But I don't think that using the B version would have been any better, so... One of my biggest aims in this matchup is in fact to keep Vorpal on my end, but there it goes. It's another one of those matches where I start to do a bunch of things you might not expect, that technically even I don't partially expect. But my opponent's aerial shielding is really important as well. Fortunately, having a basically safe sweep really helps, as once you've gotten into certain situations that you're relatively sure your opponent won't hit a button, you have a lot of good options there. In order to do this fully correctly, therefore, one must generally master Seth's fastfall. But the specifics of how to do the fastfall setups against the Nase tend to be a little different than other characters. I overdid it, but that was definitely the sort of thing I'm usually supposed to be trying to do. This is technically another matchup where the same sorts of things happen. Lyn is a bit more able to parry her way out of Nanase's stuff, and also slightly less able to do certain types of aerial attacks, lockdowns, and so on, but she dodges really well, meaning that The nanase has to be more on point for what is actually happening at any given time. While you don't necessarily have to care as much about confirms, because once you're in a bad space, you're already not going to get out of it. That's Lin as a character in a whole. But moving around the opponent and targeting them in the air doesn't really change too much. In fact, you need to spend a lot more time thinking about where Lin's moves will put you after she's finished hitting you with them. Since the player is often much more on point than a lot of other characters because she has to have so much variation. Understanding that she will not be able to land a hit and then change to something else is kind of a big deal. Delaying your moves until the last possible moment can help from both sides in this matchup. But then again, it starts to come down to who has Vorpal. You can continue to watch the gauge at the bottom of the screen, probably more so than the fight itself, since it's going to be the thing that's largely making the decisions. Good timing on parry there, as they were expecting a full attack, which Rusar just didn't do, but still. In fact, both playing with such a strong intent on movement that they've gotten to full meter and don't have anything to do with it. And that's not uncommon as far as I know. Like, you can absolutely use it for confirms and bigger damage, but because of the way the game scales, sometimes you just need to do it to get a good hit off a confirm of some other situation, or to have that happen. And while this is not a common use of meter at higher levels, mid-level players tend to need it a lot. Specifically, a combo that will, or rather a stray hit that will not convert into a combo using anything other than a metered option. Once you've learned a few of those, you can definitely improve your overall damage. But this is mostly, again, only against players who you can beat in neutral, just it takes forever to do that. What you saw just now is probably a better use of it than other things. Once you've got to full and the match has started to get relatively low in health, going for a big burst to get some pressure going will still leave you with a full meter to use for that stray confirm. One thing that comes up a lot in high mobility matches like this is guarding out of positions where you've dropped and you don't know whether or not you should try to attack. If you can't tell if it's your turn or not because of some weird stray interaction your opponent and you had with probably just one of you whiffing, your best bet is usually to go for your crouching guard. This is because your opponent is unlikely in most situations to go for their overhead in that situation. Most overheads will lose to basically any button hit and therefore make it a relatively poor main plan. But if you've had bad experiences being killed by your opponent starting to hit buttons and you not being pushed out far enough, can be a problem. If you're confident that you're going to hit, great, but there's usually not enough downside to guarding, because even if your opponent did the same, you hitting buttons wouldn't have helped. It would just be the exact opposite situation. This is particularly strong in situations where going for the throw isn't the likeliest thing to work. From either side, your own or your opponent's side. Lyn is more likely to go for throw in those situations than a lot of other characters, simply because of her style, but you still overall have a good reason to do this. Because whereas the rest of the match is trying to get off the ground and into your optimal position as quickly as possible, that weird interaction in the air situation, or missing an attack as you just saw, is usually just a sign that you're supposed to do full guard. As you practice your combos, you can get better and better at converting those types of thing into big damage, but big damage is still relative to the game. And the number of interactions you have to have in order to win out increases exponentially as both players get better at neutral, and this is countered by both players getting better at damage output and combos. If you've come into this game and been taught how to practice combos and confirms, your matches will probably last longer if your opponent is really good at neutral, but not at their own combos. Similarly, if you came in with a lot of neutral skill from other games, let's say, and haven't got to learning combos or can't manage the confirms, the matches will be long for the other reason. A large part of what both of these characters are doing right now is more so trying to feel the other out and make sure they do something wrong than to actually land an attack. It's not very obvious, but a lot of this stuff is meant to fake the opponent into thinking an attack is coming, so that they can then launch the real attack that will follow it. Lots of repositioning movement and other things that are technically intended to hit but are expected to be blocked. This is likely to be a little different. As far as I know, the main thing Wagner needs to do in this match is buy time. She is so much stronger in this matchup with her weapons charged that she's more or less just looking for those moments. Once she takes a hit, she has to buy time and defend and get out of spaces so that she can get back to that position. If she can happen to land a stray hit and take the knockdown will probably be toward getting more stuff, because anything else just doesn't pay off as much. You can sort of see it here. Aside from that uppercut, our Wagner hasn't necessarily dealt that much damage during the points where there is no charge on either weapon. The uppercut really helped, obviously, but you know. So there's pressure, because the pressure will generally work, and yes, charge 1, back off, charge 2, and now we begin again. It does not in fact necessarily make sense to chase her down and try to make sure that she doesn't charge. What you usually want to do is something that's a little less intuitive. You want to move to a position where she's likely to make a mistake, rather than trying to stop her from managing the charge at all. She'll avoid or counter a lot of your other options, especially if she charges the shield first. But you'll notice even there, it wasn't a big payoff. Still, it did stop it. There was just some danger involved. Counter made sense. And that was just basic defense. With enough damage to not have to think about charging them. Fortunately, this character doesn't have low damage by any means of the imagination, so it's easier to set up situations that benefit her. You see very good spacing from the Lin here on engages, because it's possible to keep the Wagner player from getting a lot out of interactions. Unfortunately, when she is empowered, she just has both superior range and overall better damage. I would have expected that to be a bait, but apparently not this time. I can fully respect the wanting to just keep attacking.
A new sacrifice comes to you.
Yeah, that was what I assumed was going to happen. Technically, this isn't the greatest idea to deal with a very aggressive Seth player. If you wanted to play retreat style, if you wanted to wait for your opponent to make certain mistakes, this is better. There's only one way I know of to beat Akatsuki with Seth though. Do nothing. He's such a relatively slow character compared to what you were normally dealing with. Now, from Seth's perspective, there's not much reason to actually quote-unquote play this match in the way you'd expect. He has really good defense on certain normals, and literally anything you do that puts you in a bad situation is long-term options for death. See? And because he can zone you relatively well, especially once he's really focused on the zoning part, trying to get in doesn't benefit you any. It's easier to make your opponent's life miserable by making them spend more time thinking about how that will have to be played. Oh, I missed it. I always forget that now. Since many of Seth's main attack styles and moves get ignored by Akatsuki's movements, or by him putting up shields that will prevent you from being able to join, you do have to take a certain amount of damage in these matchups sometimes. Understanding that you must take damage is always harder. I think I should have done jump B there. But you'll notice that I'm still doing too much. Like, the answer here is to do basically nothing. Get the life lead, and then make my opponent's life miserable, but without actually intending to hurt them. Because I can dodge these literally all day. Even when you mess up and lose the life lead in this way, you're mostly depending on can you defend against pressure, and do you lose Vorpal, stuff like that. I'm not sure if the lag changed, but definitely something about my timing changed. Still, I don't think I would have gotten out of it regardless. Facing a high mobility character with that sort of flow is generally harder for Akatsuki, simply because there's too few engages. You can definitely get around the idea that the opponent can just sit there and do nothing, but here's another perfect example of the same thing. Phonon has the ability to attack the space that Nanase wants to be in, so this is, again, not really a counter pick per se, because I don't necessarily think this works terribly well, but it is definitely something you can do. From Nanase's side, she generally wants to delay and then use the... I've forgotten the name of that move. The one that advances across the ground. But the amount to delay is always the hard part, because Phonon attacks very, very leisurely, let's say. And expecting to be able to do it because she has stopped moving is usually not the answer. So when I say delay, it's hard to explain what I'm talking about. In general, in these games, as noted, you have to make your opponent not want to do whatever it is they're doing normally. And for Nanase, that can be quite difficult because, again, Phonon can hit so many spaces. But once you see Phonon go into the air, she has a lot less options. You can either shield yourself if she advanced, or you can go into the air yourself if she didn't. If your spacing is good enough, her refusing to go into the air is a problem for her anyway. You do have to, however, live with the fact that once you've gotten fairly far in, but messed it up so that she now gets to start hitting you, you have to start over. And that's one of the things that makes Eunice particularly frustrating for people who don't like to play against zoning. The necessity of starting over every time you fail your approach, because there is long enough block string stuff that your opponent basically gets to control where you are on the screen from the moment they've landed any hit, even ones that you block. Zoners can put you much further away because they can keep it going for much longer without having to think about whether or not it's actually a good idea to do it. But it is very important to remember that just because she has done these things, it does not mean that you have to put up with it, let's say. There is not a lot of damage that Phonon gets out of doing these things herself. Whereas your character, chances are, has a lot more damage somewhere. So you can spend most of your time trying to decide whether or not your opponent must come forward or not. In fact, that's the best way to think about this matchup in general. Does the Phonon need to step forward to reach me? If she does, then expect to need to counter an attack. And if she doesn't, then expect to either need to make it that way, similar to the Dalsim matchup in Street Fighter, or just relax because you need to use meter or just start over your approaches. But your opponent will burn through a massive amount of energy to do this, and she then has to start over too. She has to earn all of that back. Relatively slowly, in fact. Similarly, if you put the shield up in front of you in the way that was just done, because you're so far away that it's okay to do that, you're generally not in any danger. It doesn't necessarily help you, but it does force her to go into the air, which is exactly what we were discussing before. She could, of course, just block it, but then you get free repositioning.
A new sacrifice comes to you.
This matchup is harder in a different way. If Seth is too aggressive, parrying will happen, and then you will die. But there's no benefit to standing in the space near Lin without being willing to attack. You can take advantage of Seth having very slightly better options in particular spaces, and hope that your opponent lets you get to them. But this is a lot of learning very small options at close range. She'll tend to win aerial interactions of one kind, but you can now use his new move to get around at least some of them. Like that. You can spend more time trying to charge up the Stitch. But because she is a relatively mobile character, this only works on defensive or retreating versions of the player. For example, you can see here you get a relatively good lockdown going if the Seth player does not know the timing you're going to use. And I definitely don't. I'm not sure what I pressed there, but I pressed something, so I deserve that. And that was completely messed up on my end, because even though she has the skill to do it from there, I needed that. You don't get much opportunities to put out the Stitch, but because she tends to attack in front of her and doesn't benefit as much from retreating anyway, take the chances when you get them. That was a waste of meter. And I got parried. I press C for that too often. Notice that was not charge Stitch, but it didn't actually work. The trick I was trying to do didn't work. Getting into the air is a really good option there. It now has a counter. It didn't really have as much of a counter before. And I'll probably be working on the execution for that counter, as it's functionally a TK. But TK uppercut is a little bit rougher on me than usual. But back to dancing around in the air without all of the extra, and with characters who are more evenly matched in their air attack buttons. Again, this is mainly going to come down to the timing and spacing of their miss interactions. Not their afterflow interactions, just I have missed now, so it's time to do something different. It doesn't always have to be that you will specifically go for the shield in that position, but it really helps to have that as a default, because then you can explicitly decide, I don't need to do that right now, I have meter, I can use my uppercut. I don't need to at all because something else is happening, and so on. Similarly, remember that in this game, we have frame 1, I believe, invincible backdashes. So once you have started to guard, you can start mashing the backdash and be almost as safe, since your opponent is most likely going to try to come in to either get a throw or go for an overhead. If you get caught backdashing, by their overhead, you generally don't get torn apart quite as badly. And all of this helps you save meter for those moments where you are cornered, but think that your opponent won't bait the uppercut or whatever it is. Keeping track of all of your various options is literally the main skill of these games anyway. And it's the skill that that your opponent technically can't take away from you. If the game allows your opponent to take your options away altogether, probably not worth your time to play it, at least not from our perspective, but being stressed about, for example, being beaten because they chose a better option, not because you couldn't react, but simply that you thought they were going to do something else, isn't usually worth your time. Most of the time you should just spend a little bit learning whatever it is that you need to deal with, and then just move on. Because it is still a question of, is it a good idea for them to do it or not, and there's almost always a counter somewhere. You see, another good option here. Normally, it's good for Nanase to follow her wind in this game, in this matchup, because Lin, again, can attack from relatively far. She can throw her weight around and get through those attacks, but she can't easily do it behind her, nor does she benefit as much from attempting an escape first. Forcing that reaction, as you just saw, I have to go here and make sure to not actually move off the space. I have to try to stop you from dashing because I expect you to dash it. This means that the effectiveness of the move rises as a whole. This is usually the moment where, if you, again, didn't expect to be baited, the uppercut comes in handiest. But it really is important that you have a strong reason to think your opponent will actually keep attacking. So the long-term tactic might have involved letting yourself take a lot of that damage simply so that you don't have to worry about it. If they're low on health and pressuring you, being caught into a loop would be bad. But managing to cut out of it in some other way, or to show that you're trying to get out of it in some other way first, followed by, okay, now I'm going to uppercut, raises your chances of actually landing the attack. Unlike a lot of other situations where your best bet is to do the uppercut early to prevent a situation. All of these changes in strategy tend to happen very quickly, and you get used to them as you go on, even in a game at this speed. Oria can reach further in front of her forward more quickly by relatively far. She can also put a shield in front of herself that Lin has more trouble getting through than certain other characters. So being at max range makes Lin have to work harder, but unfortunately once you have given up the options to cut and bring down the opponent that happen from actually attacking, you're likely to take more damage faster. So you can see here that being placed into that position means that our Ori spends a little bit more time trying to actually get some damage in through offense. This might just be a ruse to make the opponent expect to have to come in a different way, which is usually quite valid. You're not really attacking, you're just trying to make them think that you are willing to attack so that they let you defend longer. Ori generally doesn't care as much, certainly in this matchup, about actually doing the guard and leaving herself open to stuff, because once the push out has happened, she actually can still land hits. And strictly speaking, Lin can't. At least not in the way you'd expect it to be. I don't know if the change in character has anything to do with that knowledge, but Phonon definitely can do more things. Because Orie is not so great at alternate attacks that aren't just straightforward, she takes too long to do a lot of others. You can play a fairly strong defensive waiting game style Phonon play, but you don't get as many options for preventing Orie from doing anything, which is kind of a problem. In other words, you are leaving yourself open for actions from the Orie side and just trusting your skill in terms of responding to all of them. This generally means that a creative player will put more stress on you, but those who are generally just stock players of a character or who are not playing the character, like just picking the character randomly, because people do that sometimes, may have a bit more problems. Now, it is Phonon that does not specifically need to put herself in the position of actually using the shielding guard. Another match where who has Vorpal matters a lot, because once Orie has it, she has a lot more freedom of movement, and overall Phonon's life becomes harder. But that was a little risky because to use the force function is once again to use up your meter. The GRD gauge suffers basically. So that was, I would feel that was really specific to the point where I wonder if the two players know each other. Ah, that bat dash. Fonan can somewhat suffer in the same way as Carmine against the force function for similar reasons. Back to Lyn, it looks like. I'm not sure if they were testing something in particular, but this is probably going to play out in full as our stream comes to a relative close. This lounge is probably staying open for a bit. I don't remember, I think this game is one where the lounge will close if I leave it, but I have other things to do and can just leave it up for a while so that people can continue their gaming. But because I can't guarantee that it will stay open, you can consider that you can come looking for it, but don't guarantee, there are no guarantees that you will find anything in particular. We also can't guarantee that there will be the EU Feeling Thursday stream for King of Fighters 15 tomorrow. There's a chance. We're still working on what are the best settings for those, because in King of Fighters it feels so strange to have like a single match, but it can take quite long to play a first to two across teams. So we'll try to find a balance for that in tomorrow's streams. Some of it was, after all, people getting used to new characters, but the game still does go on for quite long. Friday content is unlikely. We're still working on bot things, specifically making them easier to input. And while we definitely have a strong interest in getting King of Fighters bots out, I'm still working on it what exactly that would be for. You can find all of the bots at 2-mk.org and figure out whether or not we're streaming at our Twitter 2_mk_FGC. But that brings us to the end of tonight's stream. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.